Confirm descent from 11,500. Let me know when you are positioned over Oxable.
Oxable.
We won't be over the airport. We're going to fly direct to a left base leg to runway 11.
Copy that.
Left base leg? That's not what it says in the charts.
They took a shortcut?
Pakistan International Airlines Flight 268 is en route to Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal. On the flight deck, Captain Iftikhar Janjua is in command. He's a former officer in the Pakistani Air Force who's now a senior pilot instructor with the airline. The first officer is Hassan Akhtar, a junior pilot with the airline with almost 1,500 hours flying the Airbus A300. Flight 268 leaves its cruising altitude as it begins the approach into Kathmandu. In 1992, Kathmandu Airport doesn't use radar to track its planes. Every movement, planned or otherwise, must be accurately reported by the flight crew. The mountains surrounding Kathmandu require pilots to make what's known as a stepped approach. Pilots must descend to a series of lower altitudes at certain distances from the airport.
Here it is. Watch my levels.
The details of the stepped approach are laid out on a chart for the pilots. The crew works its way through the steps towards Kathmandu, approaching from the south. They should be touching down in about 6 minutes.
Alpha Charlie Hotel, continue to taxiway number 2.
Pakistan 268 is at 10 miles.
Report your level.
We crossed out of 8,500. 200 now.
Roger. Clear for final. Report 4 miles, runway 02.
We'll call you at 4 miles, Pakistan 268. Clear for final, runway 02.
Runway 02.
Flight 268 is now less than 10 miles from the runway. Air traffic control waits for the flight crew's next position report. 3 minutes go by. Flight 268 should have reported that they've reached the next step by now.
Pakistan 268 Tower. Pakistan 268, this is Tower.
As the minutes tick by, air traffic controllers come to a horrifying realization. Flight 268 is missing somewhere in the Himalayas. It doesn't take much time for Kathmandu air traffic controllers to get word that PIA Flight 268 has crashed somewhere in the Himalayas. Within hours, the plane's wreckage is found on the side of a mountain. The flight was carrying more than 20 tons of fuel, and the plane is completely consumed by fire. All 167 people on board have died. Nepalese soldiers have retrieved the aircraft's black boxes from the wreckage of PIA Flight 268. Investigators look at the plane's flight path as the crew prepares for landing.
They started their descent. At 16 miles out, they're at 10,500 feet. Then down to 9,500 at 13 miles. 8,200 at 10 miles. Then quickly down to 7,500 until impact at 7,280.
The data reveals an astonishing fact.
So, 1,000 feet too low, right from the get-go. Wait a minute. There you go. Perfect match. They were flying the approach, but one step ahead.
What if the problem is the actual approach chart itself?
To avoid the mountains surrounding Kathmandu, pilots follow an approach chart about the size of a large postcard. It provides the specific altitudes pilots must take at set distances from the airport. They study the same chart used by the flight crew.
So is, let's say, 8,200 feet the right altitude for 10 miles or 8 miles? It's hard to say.
Even harder when it's actual size.
Investigators need to know how the crew would have prepared themselves for the complicated approach. They examine the cockpit layout of an identical Pakistan International Airlines Airbus A300.
There's no place to clip an approach chart here. There is just here. Now only the captain can see it, and he'd have to keep turning his head. Unlikely they use that. More likely he put it here.
The other clip is a full 3 feet away from either pilot.
That's not much better. It's almost impossible to read, and that handle is blocking the descent profile.
They learn that Pakistan International Airlines has only 2 places for pilots to clip their charts. Both positions make it very difficult to read a 4-inch wide piece of paper.
Could it be?
Then, quite by accident, the investigators discover a key clue regarding the pilot's misreading of the approach chart.
This definitely makes it look like 10,500 is the correct altitude at 16 miles.
Robinson finally has a theory he can put to the test.
Kathmandu Tower, good afternoon. Pakistan 268, 25 miles at 11,500.
Just a few minutes before impact, the first officer reports being 25 miles from the airport at the correct altitude of 11,500 feet.
Pakistan 268, report 16 miles, wind 180, expect Sierra approach.
Roger, call you at 16 miles, expecting Sierra approach. Sierra approach, Commander.
But when the captain looks at the approach chart, his thumb may have obscured the correct next altitude.
Here it is. Watch my levels.
Now, instead of maintaining 11,500 feet, Captain Janjua dials in the next altitude on the chart.
Descending to 10,500.
Oblivious that his plane's approach is now 1 step ahead. The crew has now made a fatal mistake. Unaware, the airliner is now descending towards a violent collision with the side of a mountain. 33,000 feet above the border between Norway and Sweden, a CRJ-200 jet cruises on autopilot during a late-night mail run for one of Sweden's largest cargo companies.
ILS approach to runway 01, inbound heading 009. Minimum
It's been a routine
altitude
flight,
is
and the plane is expected to land in about 30 minutes.
Approach, we need to climb and turn right.
Acknowledged.
And according to last ATIS, we can expect light wind and 0. What the hell?
Suddenly, the captain sees his plane is in a steep climb. He pushes the nose down.
What?
What?
The pilots can no longer make sense of what the plane is doing.
Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!
Air Sweden 294.
Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!
294, understood, Mayday.
What is the nature of your emergency, please?
The plane loses almost 10,000 feet of altitude and speeds towards the ground at more than 450 miles an hour.
Bank angle. Bank angle. Bank angle. Bank angle.
West Air Sweden Flight 294 hits the ground at almost 600 miles an hour. The plane is obliterated. It takes 3 hours before rescue helicopters arrive. Even from the air, it's obvious the pilots could not have survived. The next day, a team of investigators from the Swedish Accident Investigation Authority, known as the SHK, arrives at the crash site. Investigators waste no time analyzing the wreckage to pinpoint the northbound plane's orientation as it crashed.
That's the front of the plane. So they were traveling east. This is the left wing, all right.
But it's in the wrong place for a plane flying east. This is Arvidsson's first clue about the accident. The left wing is found in the south end of the crater, and the right wing is in the north end. For a plane traveling east, it should be the other way around.
If they were coming in this way, and the left wing is over there, and they must have been upside down.
The position of the wreckage and the size of the crater paint a picture of a plane hitting the ground off course upside down and at a blazingly high speed. Incredibly, both of the plane's black boxes survived the crash. They're sent to France, where the data can be downloaded. Investigators hope the data will shed light on why the plane was so badly out of control. Investigators in Stockholm try to understand discrepancies in Flight 294's flight data.
Right here, the data shows a steep pitch up, but the plane flies level and then pitches down, not up.
Investigators soon discover that it's not just the pitch data that's off.
Right here, heading and roll are wonky too.
All four parameters come from what's called an inertial reference unit, or IRU. It's made up of gyroscopes that provide information to the cockpit displays and to the flight data recorder. There are two IRUs, one for each pilot's display.
The FDR gets its data from the captain's side, IRU.
The captain's display and the flight data recorder both get their pitch data from the same source.
Now this is what the captain was seeing.
Investigators are coming to a troubling conclusion. The captain's instrument was telling him the plane was pitching up when it was still flying level, and that it was rolling to the right when it was actually rolling left.
What the hell?
It's now clear the pilot was receiving bad information from a faulty IRU. Is it possible the first officer was too?
The FO's instrument has its own gyro.
Investigators learned that IRU-1 was only feeding the captain's instrument. A second IRU feeds the first officer's display and is not recorded by the flight data recorder.
So is it possible that both sides could have failed?
If the first officer's instrument was correct, he should have seen that the plane was flying straight and level. So why did he allow the captain to push the plane into a high-speed dive? To find out, the team recreates the flight in a simulation based on the data from IRU-1.
Okay, start the animation.
It paints an almost incomprehensible picture.
3 seconds after his instrument shows a pitch up, he pushes the nose down.
When the captain pushes the nose down, his ADI continues to show a pitch up, so he keeps pushing the plane into a steeper and steeper dive.
Then they begin to roll to the left.
The plane continues to roll until it's on its back.
Eventually they do reach a speed of 508 knots.
Flight 294 hits the ground inverted at a speed of almost 600 miles an hour. Investigators can now see what happened, but they still don't understand why the failure of a single instrument led to such a sudden and catastrophic crash.
How do you go from level flight at 33,000 feet to 1,000 kilometers per hour impact in, what, 1 minute, 20 seconds?
Uni Air Flight 873 is nearing Hualien Airport in Taiwan.
Flaps 11.
Flaps 11.
The crew prepares to land right on schedule. But as they close in, the first officer struggles with the landing.
Too high.
Too high.
You are sinking too fast. I have control.
The captain takes over the controls.
You have control.
The captain engages the thrust reversers and hits the brakes. The plane touches down with plenty of room on the runway to come to a stop. But as the plane slows, a fire erupts immediately and spreads quickly. Passengers instantly panic. Moments after the fire starts, the power goes out.
Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!
Black smoke spews from the still rolling airplane. Panic is as dangerous as the fire.
You have to stay calm!
The terrified passengers aren't waiting for the plane to stop. They rush for the exits. Seconds after the blast, the plane comes to a complete stop. The captain issues the order.
Evacuate! Evacuate! Evacuate!
The 90 passengers and 6 crew members only have seconds to escape. The captain is the last crew member to leave the aircraft.
Like some ship captains do, he stayed with his aircraft and made every effort to make sure everybody was off.
Anybody there?
It takes more than an hour to contain the massive fire. By the time it's out, only 59 of the 90 passengers are accounted for. When firefighters finally extinguish the massive inferno, they board the ruined plane looking for the missing passengers. To everyone's relief, there are no bodies aboard the burned wreckage of Uni Air Flight 873. The missing passengers are located. But it could have been much, much worse. Taiwanese and American investigators are struggling to determine what triggered the massive explosion aboard Uni Air Flight 873. They turn to the black boxes for clues.
Hualien Tower, good afternoon. 15 miles an hour.
And as investigators listen, they soon discover it's uneventful, except for a somewhat bumpy landing. After touchdown, the captain engages the thrust reversers and hits the brakes.
It came right out of the blue.
There was absolutely no hint of trouble before the explosion. The sound itself could be the biggest clue on the audio tape. It wasn't the very rapid high-frequency spike of a bomb.
Send it in for analysis, please.
The sound of the explosion on board Flight 873 is compared to sounds of various types of explosions.
we determined it was a gaseous explosion.
But the flight data recorder shows no irregularities with the fuel systems on Uni-Air Flight 873.
Whatever it was exploded here.
Investigators now focus on the overhead bin above seat 8B. They wonder if someone brought explosive materials on board. Investigator Tony James decides to examine the burnt-out plane for clues that may have been missed. James focuses on the area around the overhead bin at row 8. On the far side, underneath seat 7C, he spots something unusual.
I found something.
It's not the look of the fragment that grabs his attention, but the smell.
It smells like gasoline.
The bottle fragment was found in row 7, just one row forward of the exploded bin. Could this be the source of the gas explosion? Investigators order up a chemical analysis of the bottle fragment. The fragment is soon identified as coming from a bottle of a common brand of laundry bleach. But lab results show that it wasn't bleach in the bottle.
No question about it. It's gasoline.
It's a remarkable discovery. An innocent-looking 750 milliliter bottle is now the prime suspect in the accident investigation. Investigators believe someone swapped the bleach for gasoline.
Gasoline could have leaked out during the flight.
Maybe.
The team gets their first big break, but it raises new questions. Why would anyone bring gasoline onto an airplane?
Parking brake.
Set. Detroit Metropolitan Airport. The crew of Northwest Airlines Flight 299 prepares to depart for Memphis.
Man, I don't think I've ever seen fog this bad.
In the tower, controllers are dealing with fog that's blanketed the entire airport. The ground controller clears Flight 299 to taxi to the active Runway 3 center. It will follow a series of taxiways known as Oscar, Foxtrot, and X-Ray that will take it to the runway's threshold.
Northwest 299, what's your position now?
Okay, we just turned down onto X-ray 299.
Roger, switch to tower control 118.4.
Roger.
As Flight 299 nears the runway threshold, control of the plane passes from the ground controller to the tower controller. The 727 is now at the runway threshold, preparing for takeoff.
Northwest 299, Metro Tower. Runway 3 center, clear for takeoff.
Roger.
Flight 299 is cleared for takeoff. The 727 is seconds away from leaving the ground. But danger lies ahead. A DC-9 is stopped halfway down the runway. In the cockpit, Captain Bill Lovelace and First Officer Jim Schifferns are lost in the fog.
This is a runway.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Oh, damn!
There's very little time to avoid a collision.
Oh, God!
Inside the DC-9, it's chaos. Firefighters and emergency response teams race to the scene. 8 passengers are killed, making it the deadliest incident of its kind on U.S. soil in almost 2 decades.
Okay, let's see where they go. And let's confirm any directional changes with the FDR data.
Investigators combine the cockpit voice recording with the heading changes from the flight data recorder to better understand Northwest Flight 1482's every movement on the ground.
3 center exit the ramp at Oscar 6. Did you get all that?
Yeah, but I'm gonna need you
Just
to have it.
kind of wind around here, and Oscar 6 is gonna be right around the corner here.
Okay.
Investigators discover that as they began to taxi, Captain Lovelace asked his first officer to navigate.
Left turn or right turn?
Yeah, well, this is the inner taxiway here. We're still going for Oscar 6.
So, left turn.
Yeah.
So, when they should go straight through Oscar 6, they turn off it and go east.
We're headed eastbound on Oscar 6 here.
Just as the controller said, you can't go east on Oscar 6. Oscar 6 runs north-south.
Northwest 1482, you were on the outer taxiway. Yeah, that's right.
The investigators next hear the course correction that was supposed to get Flight 1482 back on track.
Northwest 1482 at Oscar 4. Take the right turn on X-ray. Report
Crossing 927.
Roger. At Oscar 4, make the right turn onto X-ray.
The DC-9 crew was definitely told to continue eastbound and make a hard right turn onto X-ray to get back on track.
So what do we do here? You
Make the right turn and report crossing 27.
The captain is now relying completely on his first officer.
Okay, so the last instruction was that Oscar 4 turn right onto X-ray.
should be 927.
You sure?
Well, that's what he said. Yeah.
Yeah, this is 927.
They are totally disoriented.
Tell them we're out here, we're stuck.
Somehow, they've made it here.
We've got two planes facing each other on the same runway. But there's signs and surface markings all along here. I don't get it.
Why didn't the airport's signage and runway marks prevent the pilots from losing their way?
This is a runway.
Just after midnight, Aries Flight 8250 is carrying a plane load of tourists and locals from Bogota to the small Colombian island of San Andres, an ocean playground in the Caribbean Sea. There are signs of a thunderstorm in the distance. Now past the halfway point of the trip, the captain is increasingly concerned with the possibility of heavy storms gathering over their destination.
It doesn't look like we're gonna get any relief from this storm.
Yeah, lots of activity tonight.
Get a report from San Andres for me.
Okay, I'll ask.
The San Andres air traffic controller is also keeping a close eye on changes to the weather.
San Andres, good morning. IDIS 8250.
Go ahead.
We want to know how the weather is at the airport, please.
Here's 8250. There is a thunderstorm over the airport right now.
Okay, Roger, thank you.
Gear down.
The weather in San Andres is changing fast.
Air 8250, there's now heavy rain at the airfield and visibility reduced to 5 kilometers.
In deteriorating conditions and just 7 miles from landing, the captain confirms the procedure in the event they have to abort the landing at the last minute.
In case we miss the approach, we go right, correct?
Yes, correct, sir.
500 feet from the ground, the crew spots the runway. The captain lines up his plane.
Air 0250 winds at 60 degrees at 15 knots.
Then the wind picks up.
15 knots, head on. In case of wind shear, we use maximum thrust for a go-around. Don't touch flaps or gear.
Agreed, yes, sir.
Caught in a sudden deluge, visibility decreases again.
Look out, Captain.
The first officer now realizes they are too low to make a safe landing.
Can you make it?
20.
Climb, Captain!
The captain pulls back on his control column. But it's too late. At 1:47 a.m., Ares 8250 slams into the ground with 131 passengers and crew on board. In the aftermath of the recovery, one passenger is dead after being hit in the chest by a tray table. A second passenger, who is severely injured on impact, dies in the hospital 2 weeks later. The Colombian Aeronautical Authority needs to find out what brought down one of the most widely used passenger planes on Earth. Ares 8250 has crashed just short of touchdown in San Andres and broken into 3 pieces. While wreckage crews transport the debris to a nearby facility for analysis, investigators wonder what role the severe weather played in the accident.
Can I show you this?
The team already knows the weather was changing quickly just before the crash. But they need to determine if the air traffic controller kept them up to date.
I updated them regularly once they were in my airspace.
San Andres, good morning. IDIS 8250.
Go ahead.
We want to know how the weather is at the airport, please.
Okay, Air 8250, wind calm, visibility more than 10 kilometers, scattered clouds at 1,500 feet. There's some bad weather near the airfield, but right now there's no rain.
Every time the weather changed even a bit, I told them.
Gear down.
Air 8250, there's a little drizzle over the runway.
A little what?
Drizzle.
Minutes later, it turned into a full-blown storm.
Air 8250, there's now heavy rain at the airfield and visibility reduced to 5 kilometers.
Did they seem concerned about the weather?
No, they didn't sound overly concerned. I was very careful to tell them everything.
Investigators need to know if there was lightning near the 737 as it approached San Andres.
Sure looks like lightning. The timing fits.
The team studies the static wicks from the accident plane. Static wicks are located on the trailing edges of airplane wings and help discharge any buildup of static energy.
If the plane was struck by lightning, they should be melted or burned.
But they are not. Investigators can find no signs of a direct lightning hit on the aircraft surfaces.
They're clean.
The team still has a lot of unanswered questions about the weather at the time of the accident. Wind shear is a phenomenon in which the wind's direction or speed changes extremely abruptly. The team learns that just 2 minutes before the crash, as the storm built, winds near the runway were gusting. Digging further into the flight data.
So, lots of headwind, but almost no downdraft.
Investigator Julian Echeverri discovers the powerful winds were hitting the plane head-on, not from above.
Not enough to slam them to the ground.
May 18th, 2011.
Seoul Flight 5428, you are clear for takeoff.
Roger, Seoul Flight 5428, clear for takeoff. V1, rotate.
At 8:05 p.m., Seoul Flight 5428 lifts off from the airport in Neoken.
Positive rate.
The plane will fly directly south from Neoken to Comodoro Rivadavia on the Patagonian coast. As per their flight plan, the Saab 340 will climb to a cruising altitude of 19,000 feet.
Looks like we're picking up some ice.
Nothing to worry about. We're expecting some light icing. It should be better when we get to 19,000.
At 19,000 feet, water droplets freeze solid, which keeps them from clinging to the aircraft.
Building up some ice on my wing.
Okay, let's get it down to where it's warmer to melt it off. Ask to descend to a lower altitude, 14,000.
Roger.
Then,
Feel that?
the situation suddenly changes.
Propeller's vibrating.
The pilots feel some vibrations. It could be a sign of ice building up on the propellers.
Put them on max.
Roger.
Oh, hell. What's wrong?
I don't know.
The turboprop is suddenly pitching down and banking.
Pull back! Pull back! Pull back harder! Trying!
The pilots struggle to get the plane under control.
Come on! Come on! We gotta come! Come on! Come on! Come on! Come on! Come on!
The turboprop crashes and explodes in a remote region of Patagonia. Argentina's Civil Defense Agency sends emergency crews to the crash site. But because of its remote location on a desert plateau in Rio Negro province, it takes hours for them to arrive. When the crews do arrive, they find there are no survivors.
Okay, let's add the flight path.
Investigators now turn their attention to the weather conditions on the night Seoul 5428 crashed.
This is the flight path from Neoken to Comodoro. Look what's waiting for them here. They flew right into this cold front.
Investigators wonder if the pilots were aware of the icing conditions and took the proper steps to protect the plane. It's something only one person can answer. The airline's flight dispatcher provided the crew with crucial information. Investigators discover the report the flight dispatcher provided did not indicate the potential for severe icing.
The report you gave them suggested icing would be mild. But it was actually severe. Where did you get your report?
The team learns that because the airport's meteorological office closed at 4 p.m., the weather report the dispatcher provided was more than 5 hours old and no longer accurate. But establishing that the pilots encountered more severe weather than they expected is not enough to prove that ice brought down their plane. In icing conditions, pilots use the plane's anti-ice protection. On the Saab 340A, that consists mostly of pneumatic boots made of rubber. The boots inflate and break up the ice on the wing's leading edge. But did a malfunction of the ice protection bring down Seoul Flight 5428?
Radio! Seoul Flight 428! Mayday, mayday, mayday!
Investigators of Seoul Flight 5428 scour the wreckage for confirmation that a failure in the ice protection system brought the plane down.
All that survived are the valves.
Okay. Let's get them checked out.
The primary function of the valves is to control the flow of pressurized air that inflates the ice protection boots. Was there a problem with the valves? When they test the valve components, it's discovered that enough pressurized air was passing through the valves to inflate the boots.
Take a look. No failures.
If the pilots knew they were flying in ice and the ice protection system was working, then ice alone doesn't explain the accident. Cougar Flight 91 prepares for liftoff. This is a commuter run from St. John's, Newfoundland to offshore platforms in the Hibernia oil fields. The Hibernia oil fields are 170 miles from St. John's. By helicopter, it's only a 90-minute flight. So for workers on oil rigs, it's the primary mode of transportation. 28 minutes into the flight, Cougar 91 is leveled off at the standard cruising altitude.
9,000 feet.
9,000 feet, copy.
3 weeks on, 3 weeks off.
Life on a rig.
I don't know what's worse. 3 weeks off, I'd get bored.
Gearbox pressure. Gearbox pressure.
MGB oil pressure. Emergency checklist?
While First Officer Lanouette looks for the checklist,
Gander Center, Cougar 91, Mayday.
Cougar 91, go ahead.
Sir, we have a main gearbox oil pressure problem. Request immediate clearance.
Back to takeoff.
Cougar 91, roger. You can make a right turn heading 300.
the controller contacts the search and rescue headquarters in Halifax.
Halifax, Gander Center. We have a mayday call from a Sikorsky S-92, currently en return to St. John's. Main gearbox problem.
The pressure gauge indicates that the main gearbox oil pressure is well below the normal range of 45 to 70 psi.
Confirmed. MGB oil temperature greater than 130 degrees.
But the reading on the temperature gauge is not what it would be if there were a loss of oil pressure.
Cougar 91 dispatch.
Go for 91.
Rescue is asking if ditching is imminent, probable, or possible.
Dispatch 91, ditching is possible.
If possible, can you update our senior pilot on the situation?
Dispatch, I think we have an oil pump problem or an oil pressure sensor problem.
Matt, can you describe the symptoms?
The gearbox oil temperature is still normal. I don't think we've lost all the oil in the system. I'm on a heading for closest landfall if this goes south on us.
Cougar 91 is still 35 miles from the nearest land. But now...
Oh, hell. Dispatch, we're ditching.
Ditching! Airspeed 122, Matt. Race! 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 Race!
The passengers and crew of Cougar 91 are now trapped inside a sinking helicopter. "17 people are dead. There is only one survivor. The close-knit offshore oil community is shattered and looking for answers. The answers lie 554 feet beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. Investigator Alan Chalk's recovery of Cougar 91 provides a big break in the investigation. Within days of the wreckage recovery, the helicopter's manufacturer, Sikorsky, has questions about the crash.
That's right, the whole main gearbox. Sikorsky. All right. Yeah, good. Yeah, we'll be expecting you. Great.
They're coming?
Yeah, and the FAA, they want to take a look at the whole main gearbox.
It turns out Sikorsky and the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, are extremely interested in the same piece of wreckage as Cunningham. Investigators learned that 8 months earlier, a Sikorsky S-92 in Australia got the same gearbox warning.
Gearbox pressure. Gearbox pressure.
But that S-92 reached land in less than 7 minutes without incident. The circumstances are identical. Is there some flaw in the design of the main gearbox?
So what went wrong?
Right here, the oil filter bowl.
The oil filter bowl filters the 11 gallons of oil circulating through the main gearbox. It's fastened to the gearbox with 3 studs. The investigators now focus on this key component.
Here we go.
Wow, 2 of the studs are gone.
This discovery confirms what investigators saw in the FDR data, an extremely sudden loss of oil. They now have concrete evidence that oil leaked because of the broken studs.
So, what made the studs fail?
What is it made out of?
These ones? Titanium.
This looks like galling.
Galling is a form of wear caused when 2 surfaces are moving against each other, particularly 2 different metals under pressure. Titanium is prone to galling, especially when in contact with steel. Sikorsky studied the Australian helicopter's broken studs and concluded the galling was caused by the steel nuts used to fasten them.
Aaron, take a look at this.
Alert to operators of the S-92, replace all titanium studs within a year or 1,200 flying hours.
6 weeks before the Newfoundland crash, Sikorsky issued an advisory to swap the titanium studs for steel studs.
They knew the studs could fail. Sikorsky said that the titanium studs would last at least a year. Cougar got the replacement parts, but maintenance didn't think that it was urgent enough to replace the studs immediately.
The question now is, why did Cougar delay replacing the studs?
Oh, hell. Dispatch, we're ditching.
Sentani Airport in Papua Province, Indonesia. Trigana Air Service pilots Captain Hassanuddin and First Officer Arya Din are on a short layover before their 5th flight of the day. The pilots have already flown 4 short flights today. This leg will take them back to a remote airport in the Oksibil area. The plane reaches its cruising altitude of 11,500 feet. The flight is so short, the captain is already preparing for the descent into Oksibil. Without the aid of advanced landing systems seen at bigger airports, pilots flying into Oksibil must keep the runway in sight during the approach.
Wings Air 1250. Confirmed descent from 12,000. Report when you are positioned over Oksibil.
5 minutes later, the air traffic controller at Oksibil realizes Flight 267 hasn't reported in as expected.
Hey, this is Oxable. We've lost contact with Flight 267. Have you heard from the pilots? You haven't? We might have a problem here.
Word of the missing plane travels fast.
Over.
As the news spreads, investigators with Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee, the KNKT, fear the worst. Flight 267 was only 15 miles from Oksibil Airport when it last checked in with air traffic control. But search efforts come up empty. Until a pilot flying out of Oksibil Airport spots smoke billowing from nearby Tangguh Mountain.
Yeah. 140 degrees, 29 minutes, 51.18 seconds east. Okay, got it. Thank you.
The wreckage is at approximately 8,300 feet on a ridge of Tangguh Mountain, 10 nautical miles from Oksibil Airport. A search and rescue team takes a KNKT investigator to the crash site. At over 4,000 feet above ground level, there are no roads, runways, or clearings. The only way to get to the crash site is on foot. The team finally reaches the crash site. A field of debris stretches through Tangguh's thick forest.
Go ahead, Oksibil.
Jakarta. We'll reach the crash site. No survivors.
KNKT investigators are facing intense pressure to determine why Flight 267 crashed. Without recorded flight data, the plane's cockpit voice recorder is investigators' last hope to learn what was happening in the air at the time of the crash. Fortunately, the CVR data is successfully recovered.
All right, we're ready? Okay, play it.
The CVR contains 2 hours of audio, including from the 2 flights prior to the accident flight.
I'll call down and let them know we're coming.
Investigators first listen to the pilot's flight into Oksibil from earlier in the day in the hopes of finding clues.
Oksibil, Trigana 267. Trigana 267, Oksibil, copy.
We're beginning our approach. Would like to descend from 11,500 feet.
Confirm descent from 11,500. Let me know when you are positioned over Oksibil.
Oksibil.
We won't be over the airport. We're going to fly direct to a left base leg to runway 11. Copy that.
Left base leg? That's not what it says in the charts.
They took a shortcut?
The CVR reveals that the pilots made an intentional deviation in their approach during their prior flight into Oksibil. The official approach directs aircraft to fly over the airport and then circle back and land. But on the earlier flight, the pilots flew directly to runway 11 without looping around.
So they take the same shortcut for the accident flight.
The last flight proceeds much like the crew's earlier flight into Oksibil.
Big plans with the family?
Investigators listen closely for any signs of danger.
Yeah, looking forward to some time off. Been very busy these past few weeks.
It's what they don't hear that raises questions.
They're not doing their approach briefing and checklist.
The team now knows that the crew missed a crucial step on their approach. While listening to the final moments of the crash, investigators make a baffling discovery.
That's it? Happened so fast. Sounds like they didn't even see the mountain.
There is still no evidence why LAM-470 flew into the ground in Namibia. The investigation moves from the field to DAAI offices in Windhoek, Namibia.
Is this the last inspection?
Looks like it.
They begin looking into the way Mozambique Airlines was maintaining the plane.
November 28th.
Day before the accident.
Everything seems to be done by the book.
The Embraer 190, purchased brand new just a year ago, has a spotless record.
Yeah, there was nothing wrong with the aircraft.
With no evidence of a mechanical problem, the team turns its attention to outside factors. They review meteorological reports from the day of the crash.
All right, Dennis, the data from Mon Weather Station is in.
Did bad weather bring down Flight 470?
Great. Why don't we start from the takeoff in Maputo?
The team scrolls through a series of satellite images spanning the duration of the flight.
Just some scattered clouds, 3,000 feet throughout the flight. Nowhere near their cruising altitude. What was the wind like?
Nothing stronger than 11 knots, so no problem there.
With both the machine and the environment ruled out, investigators have only one more avenue to pursue.
Okay, let's look into the pilot records.
Were the pilots responsible for the crash of Flight 470? Investigators consider if the pilots of LAM-470 played a role in causing the crash.
Captain Hermanio dos Santos Fernandez.
Born in Mozambique, 49 years old. Here we go.
How familiar was Captain Fernandez with the Embraer 190?
Positive rate. Gear up. Gear up.
The team scrutinizes his pilot records. Captain Fernandez was not only well-trained,
2,500 on the Embraer 190.
9,000 flight hours total.
he was a very experienced airman. Investigators have exhausted all available avenues of inquiry and come up empty.
Any news on the recorders?
Not yet, but I'll check in.
Okay.
Search and rescue aircraft deploy to try and find Mozambique Airlines Flight 470. But it's park rangers in Namibia's remote Wabwata National Park who first come across a tangle of wreckage. It's clearly Mozambique Airlines Flight 470. All 27 passengers and the flight crew are dead. The site is in a roughly 280-mile strip of Namibia, straddling Botswana and Angola, putting the investigators from Namibia's DAAI in charge.
Okay, We got a lot of ground to cover. Let's find the point of impact.
The team combs through the debris for any clues that could help explain the crash. The last radar plot of the flight showed the plane was in an unusually steep descent moments before the crash. But the crash site adds important details.
Okay, so the plane came down there and was headed in this direction, towards Luanda.
Flight 470 was headed in the direction of its destination. It was not off course. Investigators look for other wreckage patterns to see what else they can learn. At the point of initial impact, investigators find two nearly identical pits.
32 feet. That's the distance between the two engines.
It's an important lead that shows the investigators the way in which the plane hit the ground. Investigators studied the actual shape of the crash site.
Okay, we're 487 meters from the first point of impact.
The wreckage pattern is long and narrow. The extensive trail of debris leads to one possibility.
Maybe they were trying to land.
To answer that question, the team examines the landing gear.
Tires aren't blown. No damage to the treads. No puncture marks. They were retracted. This wasn't an emergency landing.
It's the first tangible clue about what the pilots may have been doing.
They weren't trying to land. Why were they coming in so fast?
In Douala, Cameroon, Kenya Airways Flight 507 is almost an hour behind schedule.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to wait for the weather conditions to improve before we take off.
A severe storm must pass before the pilots can depart.
Tower, Kenya 507. Looks like there's a break in the weather. Requesting startup.
Okay, 507. Startup approved.
Startup checklist. Quickly, please.
Generators on.
A few minutes before midnight, Flight 507 is finally ready for takeoff.
Okay. Takeoff thrust is set. Speed building on board.
Check.
80 knots.
Check.
V1. Rotate.
Just after midnight, Kenya Airways Flight 507 finally departs for Nairobi.
Allah! Bank angle.
Suddenly, the 737 rolls dangerously to the right.
Allah!
The captain fights to level the plane.
Bank angle.
But it continues banking further and further right.
Bank angle.
Despite the pilot's efforts, they keep rolling.
We're crashing!
Yeah, we are crashing. Left! Left! Left correction!
Bank angle.
5 hours later, the controller in Douala is ending his shift.
Douala Tower. No reason I can think of. They should be there by now.
Kenya Airways Flight 507 should have landed in Nairobi 45 minutes ago, but the plane has still not arrived.
Sure.
And no one even knows where to start looking for it. 2 days later, search teams finally locate the wreckage of Kenya 507. It's 3.5 miles southeast of Douala Airport. The 737 has crashed into a mangrove swamp and is submerged in mud and water. There are no survivors. The crash of Kenya Airways Flight 507. A key piece of evidence is quickly found, the 737's flight data recorder.
Well, looks pretty good, considering.
Technicians in Canada have been able to extract the FDR data. Any malfunction warnings during the flight would provide an important clue.
No warnings.
They find no signs of any system failure. As the team continues looking through the data,
but look at this.
They discover that just over a minute into the flight, a different kind of alert did go off.
Bank angle alert at an altitude of 2,800 feet.
For investigators, this is their first real clue about what happened to Flight 507. Any roll exceeding 35 degrees is considered extreme. Once reaching that angle, a warning alerts pilots of danger.
Rotate.
When investigators review the pilot's inputs after takeoff, they make a critical discovery.
Get up.
Okay.
He was turning left from the moment they left the ground. And then he keeps making corrections to the left.
Looks like he's trying to keep the plane level.
But what caused the slow roll to the right in the first place?
Bingo. It's the way the flaps are rigged. Give it a slight right roll.
The flaps increase a plane's lift at slower speeds. On this particular airplane, the left flap provided slightly more lift than the right one. This discovery explains why the captain kept his control column turned to the left immediately after takeoff.
Well, that's weird.
But it doesn't explain an even more puzzling element of the flight data.
Look at this. The captain's control wheel inputs seem to stop. It's like he just let go of it. 6 degrees right, he does nothing. 11 degrees, 15 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, and still nothing.
As the plane's bank angle approached 35 degrees, neither pilot took action to stop the increasingly dangerous roll.
Bank angle, bank angle. Allah!
Until the bank angle warning sounded.
Bank angle.
And then he does this. Right, left, right again, left again.
Bank angle, bank angle.
The data paints a baffling picture of the 1.5-minute flight.
Who flies like that?
That was puzzling to us. So it really highlighted that we needed more information, needed more data, and that data is the CVR. The CVR is what tells us the conversation, what might they have been looking at.
But after weeks of searching the crash site, there's still no sign of the cockpit voice recorder.